Today's headline is In Man's Clothes. Mrs. Seelye was a veteran of the Civil War. The subheadline says Enlisted as Frank Thompson, carried a musket, and was a spy. She was given a pension for injuries received in the service. It says the death of Mrs. L.H. Seelye at LaPorte, Texas, closed the career of a remarkable woman whose history is perhaps the most unique and interesting of any woman of this generation. She at least furnishes the only well-authenticated case of a woman who served as a private soldier in the ranks during the Civil War, and in the threefold capacity of common soldier, field nurse, and spy, proved herself over and over again one of the best and bravest men in the regiment. After Vicksburg, she was attacked by fever and became so ill as to be released from duty. During convalescence, she wrote The Nurse and Spy, after which she returned again to the Army. Not until 20 years later was it known by her most intimate comrades in the service that the Frank Thompson whom they had known and loved was a woman, a truly wonderful case of concealed identity. Sarah E. Edmonds, for such was her maiden name, was born on a farm in Maguadanek, New Brunswick, not far from the St. Johns River, where she lived until about 20 years of age. Partly from the love of adventure, and partly for the business prestige it would give her, she determined to take advantage of her stalwart figure, assume a man's costume, and under the name of Frank Thompson, carry on the business of agent for the revised edition of the Bible. She met with no difficulty in the disguise, and was remarkably successful in her undertaking. She worked her way selling Bibles down through Nova Scotia and the States, until in the fall of 1860, her route brought her to Flint, Michigan. Miss Edmonds was at this time, with so many others, greatly agitated by the difficulties between the North and South. Though not an American, and not obliged to remain in the country during a conflict, she espoused the federal cause with ardor, and when immediately following the firing on Fort Sumter and the President's call for troops, the Flint Union Grays asked for recruits, Frank Thompson was among the first to present himself. Volunteers in those days were not subject to the strict examination of recent recruits. Within a short time, Frank was with the Army of the Potomac, devoting every possible moment to caring for the sick and consoling the dying. After the terrible defeat at Bull Run, she lingered on the field ministering to the wounded, though repeatedly warned that the Rebs were coming, until finding herself quite alone, she proceeded to make her way to Centerville. As the Confederates had not then arrived, she could not make up her mind to continue her retreat without first going into the stone church, crowded with wounded and dying Union soldiers. She remained, giving them water, until the tramp of cavalry was heard at the very door, when she darted out, and as the night was exceedingly dark, and the rain coming down in torrents, managed to elude observation. Seeing that there was no escape by the street, she climbed a fence, ran across lots, coming out on the Fairfax Road, and started on the double quick for Washington. She arrived at Alexandria at noon the next day, her shoes literally worn off her feet, and nearly exhausted, having walked the whole distance in the rain without food. One morning, when the troops were stationed before Yorktown, word was brought that a federal spy had been captured and was to be executed, and it was of the utmost importance to the Secret Service that the vacancy should be filled. Frank Thompson immediately offered her services, and after a rigid examination as to her character, information, knowledge of firearms, etc., was appointed to the perilous undertaking. She chose the disguise of a contraband, and soon after crossing the line was forced by a Confederate officer to wheel gravel for the erection of a breastwork. The work was hard for the strongest man, but Frank, helped out occasionally by a good-natured black man, managed to pull through the day, though her hands became blistered from wrists to fingertips. At night, however, she was free to ramble about the fortifications, and for the following few days she contrived to exchange work with other contrabands. One night, being put on picket duty, she took to her heels and at dawn entered the Union lines with accurate and detailed information. Frank Thompson's next visit to a Confederate camp was in the disguise of an Irish female peddler. During this expedition, she was lost in a swamp, suffered much from fever and ague, ran into the very jaws of death, and escaped only by the most clever strategy. She was afterward pressed into the Secret Service several times, and also acted as a detective within our own lines, trapping a number of Confederate spies. In 1863, Frank Thompson was promoted to the position of orderly on General Poe's staff. While acting in this capacity, she was one day dispatched in the greatest possible haste from Jamestown with a report to Washington. She ran her horse down, jumped from his back, ungirded her saddle, hastily buckled it upon a mule standing nearby, and started afresh. Unfortunately, she had failed to observe that the animal was blind, and in taking a ditch, it stumbled, threw its rider, and fell across her unconscious body. "Why don't you write to him and tell him the whole story?" asked her husband. "Ah, you don't realize what all that involves," replied Mrs. Seelye. "For one thing, I should be deluged with correspondence." Nevertheless, she dropped a line to Captain Morse, asking for news of him, requesting him to address Frank Thompson in care of L.H. Seelye. A long and cordial letter was the result, begging for Frank's history. Mrs. Seelye then confided her story to her old commander, imploring him to keep the secret as sacredly as she had done for the past 20 years. The good man really meant to do so, but human nature is weak. Gradually, the truth leaked out, and in 1884, Mrs. Seelye received an enthusiastic invitation to be present at a reunion of her old regiment, the 2nd Michigan, to be held at Flint. She accepted, and there met her old comrades for the first time since she had fought by their side. This story came from the great state of Massachusetts, being reported in the Boston Sunday Globe of November 20th, 1898. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.